want to be in old New Hampshire. I want to go.
Hello on this snowy Groundhog's Day here, February 2nd here in New England. This is Robert Cameron Weir, Chair of the Publications Committee of the New Hampshire Society of Genealogists. I'm pleased today to welcome Sean Furniss, author of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Warnings Out of Town, 1722/3 to 1769 in the New Hampshire Genealogical Record, Volume 33, Number 1. And I'm pleased to say that that issue is now with the printers and hopefully will be in the mailbox within a couple more weeks. Thanks, Sean. Thanks for joining. Hi.
Hi, how are you today?
Oh, doing fine. Always nice to see a little snow blanket in the ground out here. First question I'd like to ask you, and this is something I like to ask of all of our guests, is how did you get started in genealogy? What's your journey been like, and what are the key steps that you've taken or experiences you've had that help you acquire the skills that you have today?
Well, I think, the most important thing or the most interesting thing is that as a child, when you're growing up, your parents may relate stories to you about their youth. And I know that my father would speak about his growing up in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York City, and living for a while up in the wilds of Maine, and that his great-great-grandfather had the nickname of being the West Indian merchant prince. And I always thought, yeah, it sounds like a story to me. And then in my mother's side, my mother was an Irish war bride. During Second World War, my father was stationed in Northern Ireland, and he met my mother, who was in County Monaghan in the Republic of Ireland. And they ended up getting married after the war. But when people would be out at a party or a group social event, people would go, "Oh, well, I have Irish ancestors." And my mother would go, "My great-great-grandfather was an American," and he had been in an American consul. And so that was things that I thought that were really interesting. And I was fortunate in the fact that both my families on the paternal and the maternal line are what you would consider to be fairly well-to-do. And so there's lots of newspaper articles about them. And one of the great things too, when you have a family like that, then you're also have opportunities for glorious scandals. And there are several of those that don't deal with the warnings out, but they make for great write-ups in your family history. And so back about 1977, I had just gotten married, and we moved to Arizona, which was about 3-4 hours from my parents' house in Southern California. And what was there that was really my center of attention at the point was the Laguna Niguel Regional National Archives, which is now closed. But I could, from my folks' house over to the archives, it was about a 30-minute drive. And I could go over there and crank microfilm to my heart's content, which is something we no longer really have to do, but it builds up those muscles, as you're cranking and cranking and cranking. And so that was where I started. And I remember once my father was trying to figure out what was so interesting about all this stuff. And I took him over, and I had previously looked at the 1900 and 1910 census to locate his family records. And I took him over there, set him up with a reel, and kind of put it near where it was going to be. And he got so excited at seeing his parents' names and his brothers and sisters' names that, it was like, I got, yeah, there is a reason you do this, and you want to share that information because it does cause people some excitement. And so at that point, I also started realizing that I needed to write everything down. And of course, there were no phones, no iPhones, no nothing like that. You had to write everything down that you found. And I started getting so many records that I came across the Richard Lackey's Cite Your Sources, which is a very wonderful little book. It might be about a 1/4 inch thick that tells you how to cite your sources, and you compare that to the monster volume that we have to use.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it was enough to get me started and allow me to keep track of some records. Then about 1978, I ended up going to Puerto Rico. I was reassigned from Arizona to Puerto Rico, and I spent 9 years there. And I absolutely enjoyed my time in Puerto Rico, but there were no libraries. I mean, it's hard for most people to imagine that there's no public library anywhere around, but there wasn't. And so my research time was more or less limited to whenever I got back up to the States and could get a day or a couple of hours off, and I was near a repository of interest. But what also happened right during that time period, I had gotten through the census records I was working backwards from 1910 to 1850. And while I was doing that, I was able to ascertain that my 3 times great-grandfather was in fact born in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And that being the case, I was able to go back and start thinking about what to do with Portsmouth. Then in '83, I was visiting friends at Hanover. A friend of ours was a radio astronomer, and he was working there at Dartmouth. So we went up there because I knew that I had some records in the Portsmouth Gazette. And so I had gone in to the library there, and it was summer, and there wasn't a student around. In fact, there was only a couple of librarians and myself in the whole place. And I went in there and I said, I'm looking for these 2 newspaper issues, one for 1800 and the other was 1799. And so I sat down at one of the microfilm readers and was anticipating that the librarian was going to come out and offer me these rolls of microfilm. And pretty soon she came over to where I was sitting and motioned me, come over here. And lo and behold, there on the table was the original volumes, the original newspapers bound in volumes for that
Wow.
time periods. And they gave me a pair of gloves, and they said, gently go through there and you'll find what you want. And I mean, I was so excited to be able to touch something that had been there when my relatives had been living in Portsmouth, that it was just, I mean, it just really stirred up the juices a lot. And they were very, very helpful in allowing me to go through newspapers there. And like I said, I was the only one in the library that day. So it was just absolutely great. I got near a library that had the New Hampshire state papers in there. And I saw that in volume 24 of the New Hampshire state papers, there was a reference to my 4 times great-grandfather for a land grant. And I went, wow, you got a land grant. What did you get that for? And, you know, it has these little terms in the statement of the land grant that he got it for his service to the crown during the recent wars, which was the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War. Okay. And then I looked at that and I thought, wow, you know, if he got a land grant, he must have applied for it, because they just don't give those things out. You know, you're not just because you're a good person, you know, unless you ask for something, you won't get it. So I thought there's got to be a petition somewhere. He had to fill out a form or whatever. And it took me a while to try and narrow down the possibilities. And finally, I sent an email message to the New Hampshire State Archives. And I guess that was that was in 2008. And I did that to the archives. And I was expecting that, you know, maybe they'd have something, but I had no idea what. And the archivist that replied to me said, yeah, we have that. We have 4 petitions that he's involved in, not just one. And I said, oh, really? And they said, sure, we'd be glad to copy them for you and mail them. And all they do is charge you for the mailing. They don't charge you for the photocopies. And so I got that stuff and I looked at it, and the land grant was sure enough was there. But what was really interesting is the amount of detail that was accompanied by his application, and the fact that there was a statement of service. And it was interesting because now what it did is it told me which ship he had been on and who the commander of the vessel was, and it gave me roughly a timeline of when he had been on that vessel. And having looked at the UK archives in Kew, I realized that the ship's logs were all in there. And so I hired a local genealogist that went to Kew and went through the ship's logs and ferreted out the ones that related to my 4 times great grandfather. And he was really amazed because he says it's almost unheard of. It's so very rare to see somebody that actually has a statement of service for their time in the Navy. So that was kind of like, wow, that's pretty good. And you have to wonder, in those petitions that are at the state archives, how many more statements of service are in those files that nobody's ever looked at, you know? So
That's true.
you know,
I mean, a lot of people track down, World War II, World War I, Civil War, Revolutionary War, 1812. Those records are very easy to get at. They're fully indexed, easy to find. But colonial war is a bit trickier. This is impressive. We have in front of us right now, it looks like a certification of Robert Furniss's served on His Majesty's ship. Is that the Dorchester under the command? Okay, so you got the date, and wow, so you can kind of fill it in, what engagements he might have been in, where the ship might have gone, what service he had seen.
well, there's a wonderful book. I don't know if I can.
The book is kind of, maybe if it's closer to the camera, maybe. Ah, there it is. Okay, yeah.
And
Warships in the Age.
Warships in the Age of Sail, 1714 to 1792. And in there is the record for every ship that was in the Royal Navy. It includes where it was built, when it was built, who the architect was, who the engineers were. It tells you all about their detailed service of where they were, what they did. I mean, it's truly an amazing book. So if you get the name of the vessel, you can get a lot more information, and it adds the context that makes an individual's life much richer when you start talking about it. And I know that and Robert's son, John Furniss, had been pressed into the British Navy. And because of the obituary notice that was in the newspaper, I was able to identify the ship that he was in when he died. And then you were able to go back and go to the logs, and you could find when he had been pressed into the British Navy and the vessels that he was on. And then you can see his promotions, and they must have been fairly desperate for crew members, because he went from being a seaman all the way up to being an ensign in the matter of a couple of months. And, so that was really interesting. And initially, all I had for him was a record from the city of Portsmouth, the town of Portsmouth, with a certification of his birth and the death notice that was in the newspaper. And that's all I had. And by going into the ship's logs in Kew and using the book on warships in the Age of Sail, I was able to put together a whole, and some other references. In 2015, we published the experiences of an impressed New Hampshire seaman, talking about what his life was like from the time that he had gotten onto the 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 floating jail out in the middle of the harbor because
Uh,
people couldn't swim, so it was a good place to have them. Put them out there. But it talks about the battles and everything, and there are newspaper articles. And at the National Maritime Museum, there's actually a replica of the vessel, so that in a little model, so you can go in and see what the vessel was like. And so it's very, one thing leads to another, and that's what I found where I ended up because of the 4 executive petitions. I was able to get not only Robert, but also his son, John. And so one of the other things that I learned fairly early on, especially after I came into Washington, D.C. area, is that you have to set some time frames for yourself, because you can only crank microfilm for so many hours in a row before you just literally wear out your arm. And so I would go into the National Archives, and I would spend the morning in the National Archives and spend the afternoon over at the DAR library. And
okay.
I was really fortunate because the office that I worked at was right across the street from the DAR library. And so on lunch breaks, I could run down there and give them my $1 fee to work at the lunch hour and get through some references and help things out that way. The document that we have here is a recommendation for William Ponsonby Furniss for a position on the island of Guadeloupe. And here I am, I'm thinking, this is kind of unusual. At this time, he was, I think this is about 16 to 18 years of age when you look at how old he is. And I'm trying to think of what is this young man doing in Guadeloupe. And it was very interesting because I found that there was a wedding announcement for him where he had gotten married in Guadeloupe. And I found that one of his sisters married a French merchant who had come up to Portsmouth and gone back to Guadeloupe. And when you start thinking about the time frame, like this is, I think, dated 1814. We just had the War of 1812, and the British were really tight on letting Americans go to their possessions in the West Indies. So what do? You look for another country, and the French owned Guadeloupe, and the French, bless them, have all their vital records books have all been taken back to Paris and have all been digitized. And so that if you have somebody who was in Guadeloupe, you can go through and find the marriages, the births, and the deaths. And again, the French, thank you very much. The women kept their maiden names. Okay.
Right.
So you really got a lot. And so one thing would lead to another. And I was surprised because for looking at people who are important in Portsmouth, John Langdon, one of the signatories here, Joseph Whipple, and William Gardner are all people that are fairly well known from the Portsmouth era. So you figure that he had to have at least a little bit of pull. Of course, they were also merchants too, and so that if you get an American consul that likes you on an island, it helps improve your trade relations and getting through the port customs. So, and there's a whole series of these. In fact, there's one of William Ponsonby's sons was involved in a scandal, and there's actually a letter in the appointment file folder that talks about the scandal. There's those 2 letters actually in there, and how he had been found in a compromising position with somebody else's wife. So.
And notable here, of course, is a relatively well-known signature at the bottom there, James Monroe, Esquire, Secretary of State. Always nice to see. So at some point, you're doing research, you're researching your family, and then at some point you took a turn to the publishing, what you found, getting it in front of a broader audience, kind of sharing what you had for other people interested in these families. And we have here two examples. One, I guess your first article with the New Hampshire Record on the Furniss family. And then the experiences of an impressed New Hampshire seaman published with the New Hampshire State Historical Society.
Yeah, that was, like I said a little bit earlier, when I started out looking at John's records, I really had almost nothing. A birth record certification and a death notice in the newspaper. And it goes like, how do you write anything up about that? Because there's no cannonballs being exchanged. There's no flags running up a ship. You don't have any idea of what his life was like. But, one of the things that people often don't realize that impressed seamen were the second largest group of unfree laborers in the British Empire.
Wow.
Okay. There was no draft in the way that we think of it, like in the 1960s and the 1940s, where they had a selective service program. No, you walked down the street and had a drink at the bar, and you had maybe one too many. The next thing you find yourself is in the hull of a holding ship waiting to be shipped out. And there was no getting off that ship once you were on there until basically the ship was decommissioned. If they went for 2 years, you were in there for 2 years. If they went for 5, unless you got orders to go someplace else, you were on that ship for 5 years. So, most of us don't really realize what press gangs were, or if we do, we've read something that said the War of 1812 was in part based upon the impressment of American seamen. Well, take it one step further and think about what the American Navy did. Did the American Navy have a recruiting program? Yeah, you and you on that ship, come over on ours. You're now in the Navy. There wasn't a lot of choice. And so while Britain may have done more impressment, the American Navy did it too. So we just don't see that very much.
Interesting. So what led you, as you said, on the Furniss side, it looks like it was a relatively well-to-do family with a record of service in colonial times, both civil and military. What led you to the Warnings Out manuscripts in Portsmouth? That's definitely kind of the other end of the social scale there.
It was, and I had been looking at some of the records that were available in the state archives, and I wasn't quite sure whether they were going to be transcripted copies of the originals or the actual original records themselves. And I thought, one of the things that we don't do very well often is talking about people who were unprivileged, who didn't have the means. And so, you don't see a census record for them that says so-and-so is destitute and he can't be in town. Got to get him out. The New England people, basically all the New England states had rules that you could only come into a city or a township and reside there if you had means and they approved. Now, if you were there, I think it's 90 days. If you were there 90 days, then you basically were de facto a resident, and that town was then responsible for your welfare. And taxpayers, didn't want to do that, and so they would have the warnings out and tell people that they had to leave. And of the records that I had, there was only one that got passed from constable to constable. But I thought it was kind of an interesting thing to look at. And the other part of this are the people that are in the poorhouse. And when you look at the poorhouse records, you can see not only the adults but also the children in there. And there are death records and things like that that you might not find for poor people otherwise. So it was just kind of the warnings out were, I think there were 73 of them. So there really weren't that many records to deal with. And so it was just like a quick project to work on. Other than there were a few misspellings and that kind of thing. But
it's definitely a kind of a uniquely New England type of recording. Usually where I've seen them, they've been just part of the record. It's been in a town record book. It's the selectman's initial minuting of their order to do a warning out. So it'll be a selectman's meeting or even a town meeting, and it's directed that so-and-so be warned out of town. And the records you have here are the actual working papers of that process. We see here kind of one side of it. It's the order to the constable signed by the selectman, not bound in a town book, but the actual loose papers. And on the other side of it, would be the result, the constable's note of, I warned this person out on this day. Mm-hmm. Or I delivered this person out of the town limits to, the next town, to the constable of the next town. And what we've done here is taken all this kind of verbose, formulaic language and reduced each one, abstracted each one into a single line. So this one we see, it was, the constable's been ordered on a given date to warn out, give notice, et cetera, Mary Huntry, who has been a resident of the said Portsmouth
10 days,
and order her to immediately depart. Then on the other side, it would have said the constable visited and warned her out on, in this case, 17 March. So it's nice, compact way of getting kind of information out of a lot of records in a small amount of space. And that's the essence of abstraction, is to take a voluminous set of information and get it into a succinct form, knowing that, if someone really wants to get the details, they can always go back to the state archives and retrieve the original document if they wish. But at least this makes more people aware that these records exist and what persons are being discussed in them. It's probably worth discussing why would a warning out, knowledge of a warning out for an ancestor, be interesting to a genealogist? What's the use of these records?
Well, they would, first off, they'd place the person in that town. And in some cases, depending upon what's on the record, it may indicate what town they came from or what community they're being sent back to. The other thing, too, is it's a clear indication that these people have very limited means. Otherwise, they wouldn't be getting the warning out. And also, you can tell that in some cases there are children, and they list the fact that they have children. And so now you know that William Hilton has had a wife and children both. And so it helps you. You may not know who they are, but you know that he had them.
Right.
So that helps. And I think there was one case in this list where the woman's husband was in jail, and it mentions his name and the fact that he's in jail. Okay, well, that's great, because there are no other jail records that I know of for that. So there are little nuggets of information you can find here and there that may help you learn something about an individual who didn't have any other records.
Right. They're kind of living at the margins of society, so you don't expect to see a land purchase. They're probably not going to have an inventory of an estate in probate records. They may not be in the newspaper. But here's kind of a remnant of a record that says on a given date, in a given place, they were there, and maybe some additional information like, they had children with them, or they were a widow as of this date. Very interesting. A few other records probably worth commending to our viewers if they're interested in kind of learning more about warnings out in New England. There's a classic text, Josiah Henry Benton's Warning Out in New England, published in 1911. It's out of copyright, and you'll find it freely available on things like archive.org and Hathi Trust and a few other places. It kind of reviews the laws and the customs and state by state for the New England states on how the system worked. A more modern one, Ruth Wallace Herndon's Unwelcome Americans Living on the Margin in Early New England, is an attempt to kind of write a biography of a few of these people, mainly from Massachusetts and Rhode Island, if I recall, using warning out records, court records, and similar sources, kind of looking at what it was like to be poor, destitute in New England, in early New England. And for Boston specifically, in their system of overseers of the poor and workhouses and things like that, there's a issue of the publications of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, volume 69 from 2006, called the 18th Century Records of the Boston Overseers of the Poor. That's freely available online from the Colonial Society's website. It's worth taking a look into. We've been talking to Sean Furniss, author of an article in the upcoming issue of New Hampshire Genealogical Record, the article New Hampshire Warnings Out of Town, 1722/3 to 1769. Thanks, Sean, for your time this afternoon. And if anyone's interested in learning more about this article or the New Hampshire Record or the New Hampshire Society of Genealogists, you're welcome to visit our website at http://www.nhsog.org, the New Hampshire Society of Genealogists. Thank you, and see you later.